Many are troubled when they hear the names, Philistines and Palestinians, for the sound of the words is alike, and the land they are tied to is the same, yet within the records of the soul they are not the same, and to confuse them is to confuse echo with origin. The Philistines were a people of the distant past, shaped in the shadow of the Bronze Age collapse, wanderers from across the sea, who came with fire, iron, and chariots to the coast of Canaan, while the Palestinians are the children of a modern age, Arabs formed through centuries of empire and dispossession, their story unfolding not in the pages of Judges and Samuel, but in the struggles of our present history. When I read the Akashic record, I see two threads that touch the same ground, yet never intertwine, one fading long ago into dust, the other still alive, carrying the burdens of exile and longing. The Philistines entered history with force, arriving on the southern coast of Canaan in the 12th century before Christ, establishing their Pentapolis of cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath. Their knowledge of iron made them formidable against Israel, and their chariots gave them mastery of the flat plains. They were not mere enemies of Israel's body, but enemies of its spirit, for they bowed before Dagon, Baal, and Ashtoreth, while Israel carried the covenant of Yahweh. Thus the clash was never only over land, but over the vision of the divine itself, and each encounter between these peoples was also an encounter between two worlds of faith. Samson's destruction of the temple of Dagon was more than revenge. It was a sign that the strength of the Spirit could topple the stone of idolatry. David's victory over Goliath was more than a boy felling a giant. It was a revelation that one soul aligned with God outweighed the iron of nations. The Philistines drew power from the sea and the forge, yet prophecy had already marked their end. Amos declared judgment on Gaza. Zephaniah spoke doom over the land of the Philistines, and in time Babylon rose like a storm and fulfilled what had been foretold. Their cities were broken, their names scattered, and when Rome sought to wound the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt by renaming the land Palestina, the Philistines themselves had long vanished. What endured was only the shadow of their name, carried forward as a mark, not as a people. The Palestinians who dwell in that land now are not their descendants, for their bloodline is Arab, shaped under the Ottomans, the British, and the storms of the 20th century. They did not come by sea with iron spears. They rose from the soil of the Arab world, claiming identity as the tides of nationalism and exile pressed upon them. Their story is modern, tied to statehood, displacement, and the unresolved question of land. To see clearly is to know that Philistines and Palestinians are not the same, though the Romans bound their names together in history. When I trace these records, I see that confusion of names is itself a parable. Humanity often mistakes the sound of things for their essence, often binds the present with the chains of the past. But truth requires discernment. The Philistines are gone, their gods broken, their cities dust. The Palestinians endure not as enemies of Yahweh in Scripture, but as a people struggling within the drama of our own time, included in the great circle of nations that prophecy gathers around Jerusalem in the end. This difference is not merely academic. It is vital, for without it men fight phantoms, thinking they resist ancient foes when they contend with modern souls. In the silence of meditation, I have often heard the warning, confusion breeds fear, clarity brings peace. To understand that the Philistines and Palestinians are not the same is to lift one veil from the mind, to see history not as a blur of repeating names, but as the unfolding of lessons that Spirit asks us to learn. The story of the Philistines teaches us that power without truth perishes, that nations built on idolatry and oppression fall. The story of the Palestinians reminds us that names can be a burden and a destiny, yet identity is not fixed in the dust of the past, but is formed by the choices of the present. Both stories call us to humility, for just as the Philistines vanished, though they once seemed invincible, so too every empire of today may pass away. Only that which is rooted in spirit endures. Thus, when you hear these names, do not stop at the surface, do not let the similarity of sound deceive you, but look deeper, discern the thread of history and prophecy, and know that God writes in the lives of peoples as he writes in the lives of individuals, shaping endings and beginnings according to eternal law. The Philistines rose into the records of history as a people carried by the tides of the sea, emerging not from the soil of Canaan itself, but from distant coasts, driven by hunger, conflict, and the unseen design that moves nations when one age collapses into another. I beheld them in the Akashic stream, descending upon the southern shores of Canaan in the 12th century before Christ, their ships cresting the waves like blades, their warriors carrying knowledge of iron that the Israelites did not yet command. This mastery of the forge, born of lands across the Mediterranean, perhaps Crete, perhaps Cyprus, perhaps even further, gave them an edge that made them formidable in battle, and their arrival marked the end of the Bronze Age world. They were not wanderers without purpose, for within them burned ambition, the hunger for dominion, and the arrogance of those who trust more in weapons than in spirit. They established their Pentapolis, 5 strong cities bound in alliance: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath, forming a confederation that commanded the trade routes, the coastal plains, and the wealth of commerce that passed between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the highlands of Israel. They became the sea's children turned into lords of the land, and with their iron chariots they dominated the flat plains that Israel's tribes could not defend. Yet power alone does not secure destiny, and the gods they served revealed the fracture at their core. The Philistines bowed to Dagon, the fish god of grain, to Baal, lord of storms and fertility, and to Ashtoreth, mother of sensual rites. But none of these deities carried the unity of truth that Israel bore in the covenant with Yahweh. Thus every clash between Philistine and Israelite was a clash of vision, pagan multiplicity against the monotheistic flame. And though Israel often staggered, suffering defeat and humiliation, the deeper rhythm was already ordained. In Judges, I saw the story of Samson, whose strength embodied the Spirit's refusal to yield to oppression. And in his final act, pulling down the temple of Dagon, the destruction of stone was also the destruction of false gods, for no idol stands forever before the eternal. In Samuel, I beheld the duel of David and Goliath, a youth with a sling against a giant clad in iron, and here the lesson was made plain. The size of the warrior matters little when spirit directs the hand, for God does not require numbers or weapons, but faith aligned with purpose. These stories are more than ancient drama. They are the soul's teaching, showing how often humanity trembles before the weight of material force and forgets that the eternal current moves unseen yet unstoppable. The Philistines, though strong, lived as oppressors, seizing the Ark of the Covenant in their arrogance, only to find plagues upon their cities until they returned it. For sacred things cannot be possessed as trophies. They wielded chariots, weapons, and strategy, yet they could not wield righteousness, and so their end was inscribed by prophets before the fall began. Amos declared fire upon Gaza, Zephaniah pronounced woe upon the land of the Philistines, and history fulfilled the words when Babylon swept in the 6th century, grinding their cities into desolation, scattering their people, and erasing their name as a distinct nation. By the time Rome arose, the Philistines had already dissolved into the empires that consumed them, and only their memory lingered, later wielded by Rome itself, when Hadrian renamed Judea as Palestina, mocking the Jews by binding them to the memory of their old enemies. But the people called Philistines no longer walked the earth as a nation, their line absorbed, their culture extinguished, their gods forgotten. What endured was not their blood, but the echo of their name, carried as a mark across centuries. I speak these truths not as a scholar of fragments, but as one who has seen the deeper records where the rise and fall of nations is written in light. The Philistines rose in strength, ruled in arrogance, fought with Israel, and vanished beneath prophecy's tide. And in their story lies a warning for every people. Power without truth is fleeting. Faith without spirit is empty. And civilizations that mock the eternal law are destined to pass into dust, no matter how mighty they seem for a season. The gods the Philistines served revealed the division in their soul, for though their weapons were strong and their cities prosperous, their devotion was scattered among idols that mirrored the fears and desires of man rather than the unity of the eternal. I beheld their altars to Dagon, the half-fish deity tied to grain and harvest, to Baal, the storm lord who promised fertility through ritual, and to Ashtoreth, the goddess whose worship mingled sensuality with sacrifice, and I saw that every offering poured upon those altars deepened the distance between them and the law of the one God. Israel, by contrast, carried the covenant of Yahweh, not as a guarantee of triumph, but as a path demanding obedience, purity, and remembrance of the unseen hand that had led them out of Egypt. And thus the war between Israel and Philistia was more than a contest for land. It was a struggle of vision, a clash of faiths that echoed far beyond the battlefield. Samson embodied this struggle, for in him was set the paradox of spirit, dwelling in a man whose strength was unmatched, yet whose weakness for temptation led him again and again into bondage. But even in his fall, the Spirit did not abandon him, and his final act of bringing down the pillars of Dagon's temple was a sign that the false gods would not endure. The Philistines rejoiced when they captured the Ark of the Covenant, parading it as a prize, but their triumph turned to plague, tumors spreading, fear rising, until they begged to return what they could never own, for the sacred does not belong to those who grasp, but only to those who revere. David's encounter with Goliath revealed another face of this conflict, for the giant stood armored in bronze and iron, his spear heavy as a weaver's beam, his voice thundering in arrogance, yet a boy with a sling and 5 stones answered him not with equal power but with faith. And when the stone struck the giant's brow, the lesson was forever sealed. God's might is not measured by numbers, nor by the weight of weapons, but by the alignment of heart and spirit. In these stories, the pattern repeats that Israel often trembled before Philistine strength, yet the moments of deliverance came when they ceased leaning on their own might and turned again toward the covenant. For whenever they forgot, they fell, but whenever they remembered, the oppressor was overthrown. The Philistine Pentapolis wielded its influence not only through armies, but also through commerce, controlling the coastal highways that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, growing wealthy from trade, and turning that wealth into power that pressed upon the hill tribes of Israel who were tied to the land and the plow. Thus the conflict was not only swords against swords, but 2 ways of life in collision, one maritime and mercantile, the other pastoral and covenantal, one looking outward to alliances of men, the other inward to the law of the unseen God. Yet within the record it is clear that the Philistines, for all their strength, were never destined to endure, for prophecy had already spoken judgment against them. Amos declared fire upon Gaza, saying their transgressions were beyond count. Zephaniah pronounced desolation upon the land of the Cherethites, and the word of the Lord promised their strongholds would be devoured. And history fulfilled these words when Babylon rose with unrelenting force and swept through their cities. The Philistines vanished as a people, their gods silent, their name carried forward not by blood but by Roman decree when Hadrian renamed Judea as Palestina to sever the Jewish tie to the land, mocking Israel by invoking the memory of their ancient foe. Yet here lies the irony, that Rome's renaming preserved the sound of a people long gone and seeded confusion that endures to this day, a confusion that makes many believe the Philistines live on in the Palestinians, though one line was broken by conquest and prophecy, while the other arose from Arab tribes and empires centuries later. When I search the Akashic record, I do not see a continuous thread from Philistia to Palestine, but 2 distinct lines, one extinguished, the other still unfolding, and the similarity of names is a veil that conceals the truth. To learn this is not mere historical knowledge. It is to glimpse how spirit allows echoes to confuse the mind until discernment is gained. For humanity must learn that names and appearances are not essence, and the soul of a people cannot be assumed by the echo of a sound. The Philistines teach us that idolatry, oppression, and arrogance end in ruin, that no city, no chariot, no iron weapon endures when spirit has marked judgment, and in their fall we are warned that civilizations that exalt themselves above truth are destined to pass, while those who align with the eternal are sustained even when they seem weakest. This is the lesson that still breathes through the stories of Samson, David, and the Ark, and it is why their memory endures though the people themselves are dust. For spirit uses even the downfall of nations as parables to awaken the living. The fall of the Philistines did not come in one moment of fire, but unfolded as a slow fulfillment of what prophets had spoken. For strength that rests only on weapons and commerce cannot endure when spirit has withdrawn its favor. Their cities, once vibrant with trade and chariot wheels, became targets for empires greater than themselves. And the Babylonians came like a storm, sweeping through Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath, reducing their strongholds to rubble and scattering their people into oblivion. Amos had declared that fire would devour the walls of Gaza. Zephaniah had pronounced woe upon the coastland of the Cherethites. And these words were not idle, but the echo of eternal law. For no nation that builds itself upon idols and oppression can escape the harvest of its own deeds. The Philistines had taken pride in their gods, had lifted high the names of Dagon and Baal, had trusted in the power of their iron, but none of this shielded them when Babylon's armies pressed in, and the record shows that their identity dissolved into the conquerors who absorbed their remnants. By the time Persia and later Greece and Rome ruled the land, the Philistines had ceased to exist as a distinct people, their name remembered only as a shadow in scripture and a memory of hostility. When Rome crushed the Jewish revolt under Hadrian in AD 135, it sought to sever the bond between Israel and its land, and in cruelty it chose to rename Judea as Palestina, invoking the memory of Israel's ancient foe as mockery. Yet the irony is deep, for the Philistines were long gone, their temples silent, their blood mingled with others, and only the echo of their name remained, carried forward not by lineage but by decree. This act of Rome sowed confusion that still lingers, for many now hear Palestina and imagine it to be linked by descent to Philistia, yet in truth the connection is sound and not substance, a historical wound turned into a linguistic snare. Nations rise, nations fall, and in the Akashic record their stories remain, not as accidents but as lessons. For the Philistines remind us that civilizations which exalt pride and resist the eternal law invite destruction, and the very name that once struck fear became the instrument of mockery used by Rome against another people centuries later. In this way, prophecy completed its circle. For the Philistines, who had gloried in idols and iron, found their memory weaponized against Israel by an empire even more ruthless than themselves, and thus their shadow endured longer than their flesh. Yet in spirit there is always meaning beyond the surface, and the fate of the Philistines is not only history but symbol, showing that the mightiest powers of one age may be dust in the next, that what is called eternal in the moment may vanish in the tide of centuries, and that only truth endures. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome all played their roles as instruments of judgment, but even they have passed, for all empires are temporary, and the soul of man is reminded through these stories that no throne, no army, no boundary drawn in sand can withstand the sweep of divine order. The Philistines serve as a parable written in stone and then erased, teaching that false worship breeds ruin, that oppression invites retribution, and that arrogance blinds a people to the coming tide. Even in their downfall, the Spirit uses their story to awaken those who read it. For when a people disappear, it is not merely chance, but the outworking of law, and when their name lingers only as a mockery, it reveals how the designs of man cannot control the designs of God. Thus the Philistines, once lords of the coast, vanished as prophecy declared, their cities emptied, their gods forgotten, and their power dissolved, leaving behind only lessons carved into the memory of Scripture and the judgment that still speaks through the ages. The Palestinians are not the Philistines, for their origin lies not in the migrations of the sea peoples, but in the long unfolding of Arab history shaped by empire, faith, and the tides of modern nationalism. And though the Romans fixed the name Palestina upon the land as an insult to Israel, the people now called Palestinians arose many centuries later through the confluence of tribes, villages, and cultures living under Ottoman and British rule. They are children of Arabia and Syria, bound by the Arabic tongue and by the call of Islam, with Christian minorities who also trace their roots to that same soil, and their story belongs to the 20th century more than to the 12th before Christ. Under the Ottoman Empire, the land was but a province among many, Without sharp boundaries, its inhabitants identifying by family, clan, and faith more than by any national name, yet when the empire collapsed after the First World War and the British Mandate took hold, the sense of a distinct identity began to crystallize, for names become sharp when land is contested. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the waves of Jewish immigration stirred by Zionism pressed upon the Arab population of the land, awakening in them a new consciousness of being Palestinian, not merely Arab, for when a people feels threatened with displacement, the bond of place becomes stronger than the bond of empire. Thus, Palestinian identity was not ancient but modern, yet it grew fierce in the shadow of loss, and by 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, displacement turned from fear into reality, scattering hundreds of thousands into exile, seeding a diaspora across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Unlike the Philistines, who vanished into the tide of Babylonian conquest, the Palestinians endured as a living people, but their endurance carried the mark of statelessness, a wound that shaped their politics and their soul. They were not invaders with iron spears, they were farmers, merchants, families rooted in the soil, suddenly caught in the collision of prophecy, empire, and modern power. To confuse them with the Philistines is to blind oneself to both history and spirit. For the Philistines had been erased long before the rise of Islam, and the Palestinians emerged not as idol worshippers, but as heirs of the Arab faith, carrying the Quran, venerating Christ in their Christian minority, and weaving their culture from traditions that long postdated the fall of Philistia. The Akashic record shows them distinct, two threads separated by centuries, one cut and finished, the other still weaving. The Palestinians of today inhabit the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, while many live as exiles longing for return, and their struggle is political, not mythic, for it concerns borders, sovereignty, and recognition. Their story is not written in Judges or Samuel, but in mandates, accords, and conflicts of the United Nations era. Yet Spirit sees that both the confusion of names and the bitterness of dispute serve a purpose, for through them humanity is tested in its discernment and compassion. If man clings to error, he will fight shadows, believing he contends with ancient foes when he wrestles with his own brothers of the present. If he learns to discern, he will see that Palestinians are not a continuation of Philistines, but a people with their own trials, their own wounds, and their own role in the unfolding drama of Israel and the nations. This distinction matters, for prophecy speaks in symbols, yet life demands clarity, and without clarity there can be no justice, no peace, and no awakening to the greater unity that Spirit requires. The Palestinians are Arabs, their identity formed in the 20th century under pressure of loss, their claim rooted in their dwelling upon the land for generations, and their presence cannot be erased by equating them with a vanished foe. The Philistines teach of judgment fulfilled. The Palestinians reveal the burden of modern exile, and together they show how names can bind perception, but truth lies deeper than sound. When men learn to separate echo from essence, they will see that the destiny of Palestinians is not to replay the story of Philistines, but to face the choice that every nation faces, whether to let bitterness define them or to let Spirit transform their suffering into strength. The conflict that surrounds the Palestinians today is not the echo of Philistine wars, but the unfolding of modern struggles born from exile, identity, and the collision of nations, for their presence in the land is tied to centuries of habitation and to the sudden rupture that came in 1948 when Israel was established and they were cast into dispersion. The sole record reveals them divided between the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the scattered camps of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond, living as a people whose root is in the soil, but whose branches are spread unwillingly across the winds. Unlike the Philistines who vanished under Babylon's sword, the Palestinians continue as a nation without a state, enduring in fragmentation, some under the Palestinian Authority in parts of the West Bank, others under the rule of Hamas in Gaza, and still others as exiles who carry keys to houses they may never again enter. Their struggle is not only for borders but for recognition, for the world debates their statehood while generations grow old in displacement, and this unresolved condition feeds cycles of bitterness and resistance. Spirit shows that their battle is not simply political but archetypal, for the land they claim is the same land that prophecy surrounds, the same ground upon which Jerusalem stands as an immovable rock, drawing the gaze of nations and the weight of destiny. In their quest for self-determination lies the reflection of humanity's broader hunger for belonging, for every soul longs for a place to call home. Yet the lesson here is sharper, for the Palestinians must learn whether they will shape their identity from grievance alone or from a vision that transcends conflict. Their majority is Muslim, bound to Sunni Islam, yet within them dwell also Christians who have walked the streets of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Jerusalem since the earliest centuries, and though diminished by migration, their witness remains part of the fabric of Palestinian life. The record reveals that identity is not one thread, but many, woven from faith, tribe, and memory, and that their endurance lies not only in resisting, but in creating a society that can hold its many strands together. The world sees them often through the lens of war and protest. Yet the deeper truth is that they are a people still in search of definition, born of Arab roots, yet marked by the uniqueness of dwelling upon the land that empires and prophets have always contested. To confuse them with the Philistines is to strip them of their story, for the Philistines fell to prophecy's judgment while the Palestinians live within prophecy's unfolding. And though they are not named in Scripture, the nations that surround Israel are, and in that circle of tension, the Palestinians inevitably take their place. Spirit warns that the danger of confusion is not merely academic but practical, for when men fight phantoms, they blind themselves to the humanity before them, and when they call the Palestinians Philistines, they cast them as ancient enemies rather than as modern souls with their own destiny. The Philistines remind us that arrogance and idolatry lead to destruction. The Palestinians remind us that exile and longing can shape identity into defiance, and the world is watching to see whether their struggle becomes a seed of endless war or a step toward reconciliation. Yet the record is clear that the struggle of Palestinians cannot be separated from Israel itself, for both are bound to the same soil, and prophecy has declared that Jerusalem will be the center of contention among nations. Thus, the Palestinian conflict is not an isolated dispute, but part of the greater drama where Spirit uses history to press humanity toward choices that reveal the heart. They are not the same as the Philistines. Yet their role in the present carries weight in the spiritual battle of our time, and their endurance teaches that no people disappears unless the law has decreed it, and that as long as they breathe, their place in the story remains. In this we see how history and prophecy intertwine, for the Philistines were erased as judgment, the Palestinians endure as trial, and both names together remind us that what men confuse by sound, Spirit separates by essence. Prophecy concerning the Philistines was fulfilled in their destruction, yet prophecy concerning the nations around Israel still breathes through the pages of Scripture, and in those words the Palestinians find themselves woven into the wider tension of the end times, not as direct descendants of Philistia, but as part of the circle of peoples that gather around Jerusalem. Zechariah declared that Jerusalem would become an immovable rock, a burden for all nations, and those who tried to lift it would wound themselves, and this word points not to a single tribe, but to the whole gathering of powers that contest the holy city, a gathering that includes Arabs, Palestinians, and many others drawn by the gravity of prophecy. Spirit reveals that while the Philistines were judged for idolatry and erased by Babylon, the Palestinians endure within the living trial of the present, their existence serving as a mirror for humanity's refusal to resolve conflict. For as long as exile festers and bitterness governs identity, the struggle remains a fire that nations cannot quench. The record shows that names carry vibration, and the similarity between Philistine and Palestinian confuses many. Yet the deeper truth is that one vanished as fulfillment of judgment, while the other persists as a test of compassion, discernment, and justice in the modern age. Nations often reduce the story to politics, to maps, borders, and accords. But prophecy speaks of something greater: the clash between pride and humility, fear and faith, domination and reconciliation, and the Palestinian presence in the land keeps this clash alive in the world's attention. Their role is not to reenact the ancient wars of Samson and Goliath, but to embody the unresolved question of belonging, and through that question the world is drawn into the drama of Israel's destiny. Spirit shows that this is not by chance, for prophecy declared that the nations would gather, and the Palestinians, though not named, are part of the living fulfillment, their struggle entwined with the fate of Jerusalem, their exile echoing the deeper exile of the human soul from peace. Many ask whether they are cursed as the Philistines were, yet the answer is different. For the Philistines were judged for their devotion to idols and their oppression of Israel, while the Palestinians are not condemned as idol worshippers, but are entangled in the consequences of history, empire, and the choices of men, and thus their path remains open, shaped by how they and others respond to the trial. If they choose hatred, they remain bound in bitterness. If they choose vision, they may yet become a channel for reconciliation, and Spirit whispers that both paths are present before them. The lesson is not for them alone, but for all nations. For the gathering around Jerusalem reveals the heart of humanity, and each nation that takes part reveals whether it acts from pride or humility, from fear or trust. The Philistines stand as a closed chapter, a warning written in ruins. The Palestinians stand as an open chapter, a question still unresolved, and the difference matters greatly, for prophecy teaches that what is unresolved will continue until Spirit's purpose is fulfilled. In the Akashic vision, I see that the Philistines' downfall teaches the futility of relying on idols, while the Palestinians' endurance teaches the danger of confusing name with essence. And together their stories remind humanity that history is not random but patterned, that prophecy is not dead but living, and that Spirit uses the fate of nations to awaken the souls of individuals. Those who conflate Philistines with Palestinians fight ghosts. Those who discern the difference see that the present conflict is not about reliving the past, but about choosing the future, and in that choice the destiny of many is entangled. Prophecy is not given to satisfy curiosity, but to prepare hearts. And the presence of the Palestinians in the modern drama of Israel is part of that preparation, forcing the world to look upon the unresolved wound and decide whether to perpetuate division or to seek healing. Thus, their role is not incidental, but essential, for by their very existence they keep the world's gaze fixed on Jerusalem, the center where Spirit has placed the measure of nations, and by their struggle they test the conscience of humanity, asking whether men will see with clarity or remain blind to truth. The names Philistines and Palestinians sound alike, yet in the soul's record they carry different vibrations, one belonging to a people long destroyed under the weight of prophecy, the other belonging to a people still alive in the struggles of the present, and to confuse them is to confuse echo with essence. The Philistines rose in strength through iron, trade, and chariots, yet they worshipped gods of their own making, and so their pride collapsed when Babylon's armies swept their cities away, leaving their temples silent and their identity dissolved into dust. The Palestinians emerged not from that broken line, but from the Arab world centuries later, shaped under Ottoman rule and the British Mandate, pressed by the rise of Zionism, and their identity crystallized through loss and exile, making them not relics of Scripture but actors in the living trial of our time. Spirit teaches that history is not mere record but lesson, and the fate of the Philistines shows that no people built on arrogance and idolatry endures, while the struggle of the Palestinians shows that no people can be ignored without consequence, for unresolved wounds reverberate until healing is sought. Prophecy declared judgment upon the Philistines, and it was fulfilled. But prophecy concerning Jerusalem remains, and in that word the Palestinians are entangled not as cursed remnants, but as part of the nations gathered around the immovable rock, their presence forcing the world to reckon with the meaning of land, belonging, and destiny. When I read these records, I see that names are not destiny, but instruments, and the Romans who renamed Judea as Palestina sowed a confusion that still lingers, a veil that blinds men until they learn to see with discernment. The Philistines are a closed chapter, the Palestinians are an open question, and the world's inability to separate them reveals how easily mankind mistakes the surface of things for their depth. The enduring lesson is that spirit does not measure nations by their weapons, their borders, or their pride, but by their alignment with eternal law. And those who mock that law, whether Philistine or Roman or any power of today, will pass, while those who yield to it will be sustained even when they appear weak. The Palestinian struggle is not yet sealed, and in their endurance lies both danger and possibility, for they may cling to bitterness and remain bound, or they may seek vision and become instruments of reconciliation. And the same choice faces Israel and every nation that circles Jerusalem, for the immovable rock tests not only Palestinians but all humanity. The deeper truth is that every nation is reflected in their story, for all people know the temptation of pride, the pain of exile, the hunger for home, and the blindness of confusing names for essence, and the Spirit uses their trial as a mirror to awaken others. When men see the difference between Philistines and Palestinians, they also learn the difference between what has already been judged and what is still unfolding, between what is sealed in history and what is open in prophecy, and this discernment frees the soul from fighting phantoms and calls it to face the living reality of the present. The lesson that remains is clear, that power without spirit fades, that exile without vision festers, that prophecy is not dead word, but living pattern, and that humanity is being pressed toward awakening, whether it wills it or not. In the silence of meditation, I have often felt the weight of this truth, that the names of nations are chapters in a greater book, that the battles of history are mirrors of the inner war between fear and faith, and that the fall of the Philistines and the endurance of the Palestinians both whisper the same call: turn from confusion to clarity, from division to unity, from pride to spirit. When the soul of man learns this, the conflict that has consumed centuries will become the soil for reconciliation, and Jerusalem, the stone of stumbling, will become the light of awakening. Until then, the lesson remains unfinished, and the names continue to echo, not as a curse, but as a summons for humanity to see truly, to act justly, and to remember that beyond the noise of history, the eternal law holds every people accountable, weighing them not by their pride, but by their willingness to align with the one who is, who was, and who shall be.